There's a block of stone in London that weighs 760 kilograms. Every museum in the world knows about it. Every university studies it. Millions of people have photographed it. Since 1822, experts have sworn they've figured it out. They swore the mystery was solved. And for 2 centuries, no one questioned that certainty, until an artificial intelligence compared the 3 versions of the text and found something that linguists had ignored for 200 years. That the oldest layer, the most sacred, the one written in hieroglyphs, says different things than the Greek text. Not minor differences. Differences that change who held real power in Ptolemaic Egypt. Experts called it stylistic variation. AI called it a systematic anomaly. What you're about to hear isn't the story you were taught in school. It's the story that was engraved beneath that story, on a stone that's been waiting for over 2,000 years to be read correctly. If the mysteries that the official world would prefer to keep hidden pique your curiosity, stay until the end. Because what you're about to discover about this stone doesn't end where you think. On July 15, 1799, an engineering officer in Napoleon's army named Pierre-François Xavier Bouchard was overseeing the demolition of an ancient wall near the village of Rashid in the Nile Delta. When the soldiers broke through the wall, they found a slab of gray and pinkish granodiorite. Dark, heavy, covered in symbols that no one understood. Bouchard recognized its importance and sent it to Alexandria. The French scholars accompanying Napoleon's campaign studied it immediately. What they held in their hands was a stele with 3 distinct blocks of text. At the top, Egyptian hieroglyphs. In the center, demotic script. At the bottom, ancient Greek. If the 3 texts said the same thing as everything indicated they should, then for the first time in 1,500 years humanity had a key to decipher hieroglyphics. But the key had a defect that no one noticed at the time. The Greek block had 54 lines, almost intact. The demotic block, 32 lines. The hieroglyphs, the most sacred script, reserved for priests, the one that theoretically should contain the most precise and authentic message of the decree, had only 14 lines. Fragmented, damaged, incomplete. The most important layer was the most destroyed. And yet, 19th century linguists worked for decades assuming that those 14 surviving hieroglyphic lines were enough to confirm that the 3 texts essentially said the same thing. That the differences were minor, stylistic. They took it for granted because the alternative didn't occur to them. The alternative was that the 3 texts were not saying the same thing at all. There is another detail that has been visible for over 100 years and that almost no one mentions. When the British Museum displayed the stone in the 19th century, its employees engraved an inscription on the sides of the block. It can still be read today. On one side, captured in Egypt by the British Army 1801. On the other, presented by King George III. The British Museum inscribed its own confession directly onto the artifact it safeguards. The stone bears the inscription of its own abduction. And for 2 centuries, the millions of people who passed by looked at the hieroglyphs. No one looked at the sides. To understand why that difference matters, you have to understand who ruled Egypt in 196 BC. They were not Egyptian pharaohs in the traditional sense. They were Macedonian Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, a man named Ptolemy I, who took control of Egypt after Alexander's death and established a dynasty that would last almost 3 centuries. The young man honored by the decree inscribed on the Rosetta Stone was named Ptolemy V. Epiphanes. He was approximately 13 years old when he was crowned in Memphis. He did not speak Egyptian. Neither did his court. The language of rulers was Greek. Official documents were written in Greek. Decrees were announced in Greek. But the Egyptian priests did not speak Greek. And in ancient Egypt, a temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was a bank. It was a source of water. It was a grain storehouse. It was the institution that sustained the agricultural economy of an entire region. The priesthood controlled a huge fraction of Egypt's arable land. They managed the debt records. They administered the irrigation systems. Without their cooperation, no pharaoh could rule stably, no matter how many soldiers he had. Thus, the relationship between the Greek dynasty and the Egyptian priests was a constant negotiation, managed through language and ceremony. And the Rosetta Stone decree was not the pharaoh's initiative. It was issued by a synod, an assembly of priests convened in Memphis to celebrate the anniversary of the young king's coronation. They were the ones who drafted the text. They were the ones who decided what privileges to grant the pharaoh, what obligations to remind him of, and in what language to communicate each part of the message. Here's a detail that seems minor but becomes crucial later on. Coptic, the last form of writing derived from ancient Egyptian, survived only within the liturgical traditions of Coptic Christianity. Coptic priests preserved it for centuries after the rest of the world had forgotten the language. This means that the only thread of continuity for the ancient Egyptian language ran through the priesthood, not the state. The priesthood always had its own channel of survival, one that the rulers of the day couldn't control. For more than 2 centuries, the academic community worked with the Rosetta Stone under an assumption that was never fully examined: that the 3 texts were equivalent translations of the same decree. And for 2 centuries, that assumption was sufficient. Not because someone had rigorously verified it, but if the 3 texts didn't say the same thing, the most famous artifact in the history of linguistics would cease to be what everyone believed it to be. And that was a conclusion no one wanted to investigate. Modern computer systems do something that no 19th century linguist could do: compare thousands of Ptolemaic documents simultaneously to identify whether textual variations between versions are conventional or follow a different pattern. What several recent studies report is unsettling. According to analyses that have compared the structure of the Greek text with the surviving hieroglyphic fragments, there are differences that go beyond ceremonial style. In the Greek text, the decree describes Ptolemy V's actions toward the temples in the language of voluntary generosity. The king grants, the king offers, the king decides to reduce taxes on his own initiative. In the surviving hieroglyphic fragments, compared with other Ptolemaic decrees from the same period, such as the Decree of Canopus of 238 BC and the Decree of Ptolemy IV of around 218 BC, the priestly language associates certain concessions with obligations that the state has towards the temples, not with spontaneous decisions of the pharaoh. In Greek, the king gives gifts. In hieroglyphics, the king pays a debt. If that difference is intentional, the Rosetta Stone would not be a simple trilingual translation. It would be 3 distinct documents superimposed on a single stone: one for the Greek court, one for everyday administrative use, one for the Egyptian priesthood that controlled the temple economy. 3 hearings, 3 messages, 1 single stone. Before discussing what artificial intelligence found on the Rosetta Stone, we need to understand what it had already done elsewhere. In 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius buried the Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and molten rock. In a villa that belonged to Julius Caesar's father-in-law, researchers discovered an entire library in the 18th century. Hundreds of papyrus scrolls, all carbonized, all sealed, all impossible to open without reducing them to dust. For more than 2 centuries, those scrolls remained intact but unreadable. No technology seemed capable of reading them without destroying them. In 2023, an international team consisting of Youssef Nader, Luc Ferreter, and Julian Schillinger, 3 technology students from different universities around the world, built an artificial intelligence model trained to detect invisible carbon ink in the internal textures of charred papyrus, using X-ray images taken at the Diamond Light Source synchrotron in the UK. The project was called the Vesuvius Challenge. The grand prize was $700,000. They won it. The first word recovered was Pyomicron Rho Phi Rho Alpha, in ancient Greek, purple dye. The text belonged to Philodemus of Gadara, an Epicurean philosopher and poet who was a personal friend of the Latin poet Virgil. A text about how to live well, about choices and avoidances. Written in the 1st century BC, buried for 2,000 years under Vesuvius. Read by a machine without anyone touching the papyrus. Richard Ovenden, librarian at Bodley, told the media that this breakthrough represents an incredible moment in history where librarians, computer scientists, and classical scholars collaborate to see what has remained hidden for almost 2 millennia. If an artificial intelligence could read what no human eye had seen since the 1st century, the question that followed was inevitable. What could it find in a stone that everyone thought they had fully understood 200 years ago? Jean-François Champollion did not come across hieroglyphics by chance. He came to them because, from the age of 11, he had decided that deciphering them would be his life's mission. By the time he was 16, he was already teaching at the Grenoble Academy. He was fluent in Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, Amharic, Latin, Classical Greek, and Coptic, especially Coptic, that language which Coptic Christian priests had preserved for centuries as a liturgical language, the last link in a chain that reached all the way back to the Egyptian of the pharaohs. Champollion understood that Coptic was not just a living language. It was the fossilized pronunciation of the dead language he wanted to decipher. If hieroglyphs represented sounds, Coptic could tell him what those symbols sounded like thousands of years later. That intuition was his decisive advantage over Thomas Young, the British physicist and polymath who had correctly identified the royal cartouches but had been unable to cross the threshold into the complete system. Champollion spent more than a decade comparing inscriptions, searching for patterns that no one else had identified. And on September 14, 1822, working with a copy of inscriptions from the Temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, everything suddenly clicked into place. He ran to his brother Jacques-Joseph's office. He burst in without knocking. He shouted, "I've got him!" and he fainted from exhaustion at the desk. On September 27, 1822, 13 days later, Champollion presented his conclusions at the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles Lettres in Paris. That afternoon, with Thomas Young in the audience, he announced that hieroglyphs combined phonetic and ideographic signs, a system that previous studies had not even considered possible. In 1824, he published his complete analysis in the work Précis du système hieroglyphique des anciens Egyptiens. The academic world didn't receive it well at first. It took years to acknowledge his merit. But the work was done. The hieroglyphs were legible again. What artificial intelligence systems are doing now is radically different. They are not trying to decipher one symbol at a time. They are analyzing the entire structure of thousands of Ptolemaic documents simultaneously, identifying whether the variations between the Greek text and the hieroglyphic text of the Rosetta are statistically consistent with ordinary stylistic variation, or whether they follow a pattern that human researchers were not equipped to detect because they were looking for confirmation of what they already thought they knew. In 2017, the British Museum launched the Hieroglyphics Initiative in collaboration with Google, Ubisoft, and Cycle Interactive, training neural networks to identify and classify over 1,000 distinct hieroglyphs. In 2020, Google introduced Fabricius, a publicly available tool that uses machine learning to translate and analyze hieroglyphic inscriptions. These tools are now being applied to inscriptions that linguists have been studying for decades. What they found when applying these methods to the Rosetta project wasn't communicated through an official announcement. It was communicated through open questions at specialized conferences, through papers that challenge the assumption of textual equivalence, and through an institutional silence that speaks volumes. Now it's worth recalling the detail we mentioned when discussing Champollion. Coptic, the language he used as a bridge to decipher hieroglyphs, didn't survive thanks to the Egyptian state or the Greek pharaohs. It survived thanks to the priesthood, the Coptic priests who preserved it for generations as a sacred language, beyond the reach of the political powers of the day. The priesthood always had its own channel. What the AI found suggests that this channel also existed within the stone itself. The Greek text of the Rosetta states the following: Ptolemy V, in his generosity, decided to return confiscated properties to the temples. He decided to reduce certain taxes. He decided to finance the sacred worship of the Egyptian gods. The words are decided and, in his generosity, voluntary acts of a benevolent king. But the hieroglyphic version, according to analyses comparing the surviving fragments with other Ptolemaic decrees from the same period, uses grammatical structures that, in the Egyptian priestly context, do not express voluntary generosity. They express obligatory restitution. These are the same structures that appear in the Canopus decree of 238 BC, when the priests listed the state's obligations to the temples, not royal concessions. It's not the king grants. It's the king returns what he owes. That difference is significant. If the hieroglyphic version of the Rosetta Stone functioned as a contract between the Macedonian crown and the Egyptian priesthood, then the decree has two simultaneous natures. Greek side, royal propaganda. Egyptian side, a binding agreement. The same text, two distinct documents. And the contract, the document that established the actual obligations of the Greek rulers toward the Egyptian priests, was inscribed in a script that only the priesthood could read. Only they had access to its full meaning. It was a double-bottomed lock, engraved in stone 2,200 years ago. There was only one problem for anyone who wanted to erase that contract. They would have to destroy that exact part of the inscription. The part in hieroglyphics. The part that no one outside the priesthood could read. And that part is the most damaged of the entire stone. On November 1st, 2025, Egypt inaugurated the Grand Egyptian Museum in Giza, the largest building dedicated to the pharaonic civilization in world history. It represents an investment of over $1.2 billion and took 20 years to build. It houses 100,000 archaeological artifacts, 25,000 of which have never before been exhibited to the public. The complete collection of Tutankhamun is on display for the first time in one place, comprising 5,398 pieces in a 7,500 square meter space. 80 international delegations attended the inauguration. The Rosetta Stone is not there. It's in London in the British Museum, where it has been for over 2 centuries. And on the sides of the granodiorite block, you can still read the words that British soldiers engraved on it. Captured in Egypt by the British Army 1801. Presented by King George III. Monica Hanna, Dean of Aswan University and co-founder of the Formal Restitution Campaign, told the BBC, "If you have 5 children and someone kidnaps one, would they justify it by saying you now have 4? The British Museum responded that it has not received any formal request from the Egyptian government. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Minister of Antiquities, was more direct. "The British and Germans have to return the Rosetta Stone and Nefertiti to us. We will not accept no. What's at stake now is more than a stone. If computer analysis confirms that the Rosetta hieroglyphic text contained obligations different from those publicly presented in the Greek text, then the artifact is not just a linguistic tool. It's a bilateral political document, a contract between 2 powers. And that document is in London, beyond the reach of the descendants of those who inscribed it. What artificial intelligence is trying to recover is not just lost text. It is the record of an agreement that someone, at some point, preferred not to be legible. The question that remains open is not whether the priests of Memphis hid a contract within the Rosetta Stone. The question is whether the portion that would confirm it, buried in 14 fragmented lines, can still be recovered, or whether that was precisely what someone more than 2,000 years ago made sure to destroy first. There's something few people ask themselves when they see an ancient artifact in a museum. Who was it really written for? Who was the true recipient? And what happened to the part they didn't want everyone to read? The Rosetta Stone remained unreadable for 1,500 years. Then, for 200 years, we thought we had understood it. Now we are entering a third era, that of machines that read what trained eyes had learned to standardize. I'm thinking of something I'd like you to consider. If you have any document in your life, any family history, any text that someone told you was already explained and closed, it might be worth rereading. The most enduring secrets are not hidden. They are carved in stone, in a language understood only by the initiated, and it is hoped that no one will live long enough to decipher them. They may be right, or perhaps artificial intelligence has just proven that time is no longer an obstacle. If you want to keep discovering the stories the mainstream media prefers we don't tell, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are more mysteries waiting to be properly understood, and we're not going to stop searching for them